All right, so I'm out here in the middle of Eagle Mountain, up the trail from Noons Creek, at a trail I like to frequent. You might hear some forest sounds because I'm actually hanging in my hammock, looking up at the trees, out halfway up a mountain, maybe a quarter way up a mountain, depends on how you think about it. And I'm going to do a podcast episode up here. So welcome to the Feather of Light podcast, where I like to talk about mental health. I like to talk about, mental health related topics and maybe philosophy and whatever else comes up, really. But trying to keep the focus on practical stuff that you can understand even if you're not in the field. And maybe if you're a client, you can apply some of these teachings to your personal practice. Anyway, that's kind of part of my aim. So today I would like to talk about the topic, well, it's probably a lot of different topics, but generally speaking, first I'll explain where it came from. So I was on Instagram, and a friend of mine, she's a coach and a women's group facilitator, and she's a lot of different hats, healer in many ways. And I appreciate when she brings me into conversations like this one. So there was a thread on Instagram that was all about men whom are coaches that are essentially taking advantage of women. And I'm trying to remember the exact post, but it was something like, you show me a man who works primarily or solely with women, and I'll show you a predator. And I think, very intentionally worded to trigger all folks, right? Like the masculine, whom are in those roles of holding space, of course, and then, maybe triggering those whom confide in male coaches and do trust men to support them in their healing. But there was a very important conversation that came about as you continued to scroll through the post. It became more evident it wasn't just meant to trigger people, it was meant to call them in to reflect on, okay, there's some very real issues here, and when men should be a part of this, let's just call it the women's journey of healing, or when it's important that they're able to step back and own if they are in partaking primarily in supporting women, what are their intentions for that? And are they able to show up as what they refer to as an embodied masculine versus I would consider a disembodied masculine who maybe isn't aware of their triggers and how their unintegrated shadow comes into effect when they're supporting others. Yeah, so I'm using my Rhodes microphone for the first time, by the way. I'm hoping it records this conversation because I would, prefer to have this be content that I can draw from, but at the same time, if I have to do this again, that's totally okay. But yeah, I remember noticing how I was feeling from that post, almost trying to discern if there were parts of me that were like trying, there's obviously parts of me that disagree with things, but like what parts of me were feeling triggered or activated. And if there was maybe some surfacing of insecurity around like, oh no, am I not capable? Is this post saying I'm not capable of supporting women? Or that men are inherently incapable of supporting women? And that couldn't be farther from the case. As far as this post is concerned, in my own personal experience, it's essentially presenting a feminine perspective that's introducing guidelines for where men ought to be a supporting role, or when there's a indirect role or a need to refer out and step down and recognize that that is the role of a female coach or facilitator or a woman in general in that person's life, whether it's professional or otherwise. And some of the topics that they were saying, be aware if men are leaning into working with women if they're doing womb healing, or if they're working with, I don't know if it's sexual energy more broadly, but when it gets down to the specifics of masturbation, like really sensitive content, things that, just sound they sound quite inappropriate for a man in a professional role to discuss those with a woman. And I mean, right off the bat, I can consider where we're referring to coaches here. We're not referring to therapists or trauma experts whom have specialized training in healing from sexual wounding or sexual abuse. We're referring to, or, like those who are birthing doulas or specialize their care. That would probably be women for the most part anyway, but those who specialize their care to support people in womb healing, somatically or otherwise. We're talking about strictly men's coaches, right? Men who are coaches that are working with, I think they're talking about shadow work or embodiment of whatever, right? Just growth in general. And probably pertains to, all the stuff that coaching can pertain to, which is pretty varied, right? But yeah, I was noticing some of the men commenting, and I was trying to kind of, not get too lost in just like looking through comments. And there was, I think, a lot of very, very respectful dialogues going on. Very likely, I think my comments, can't remember all the details of it, but I was basically just affirming that this is a very necessary conversation, and I feel like there's a need for this, and I appreciate the perspective brought by my friend who, tagged me in that post, and I also felt the need to speak to how both the masculine and the feminine, because of course in that post it's referring to women and the challenges that they face when there are men who are essentially predators. But I just want to speak to how the underlying theme also seemed to be where if there's a lack of training, right? So many of these coaches, it's kind of debatable where their training is coming from, right? They don't have the ethical training or standards that, say, a counselor does. But without that proper training, many of these individuals, men or women, likely don't have the professional expertise or awareness to know where their scope of practice exists, know where they ought not to practice, right? Some of those other topics, those other experiences that they aren't, based on their gender identity, based on their experiences, they are not trained to handle and hold space for. And then when they don't have that discernment, what might happen is they aren't able to recognize that, hey, I can refer this person out. This person can actually go and work with, and in the post they were referring to, you can encourage a woman to go work with other women and heal that wound in a support group, or heal that wound at a retreat, or heal that wound with a female coach or counselor or whatever, right? And that ability to refer a person out and to know when you need to do so, that is just basic ethics, right? That is just embodied, applied ethics. It's applying your understanding of ethics. And so without that, man or women, you're focusing, you might be in a situation where you're focusing more on your needs, and you're unable to understand where that line exists and set that boundary or refer someone out. So I think that there was a lot more going on in that discussion, and I feel like there's so much more to this conversation in general when it comes to men versus women and how they heal, and how coaches support people in general, and then how men might support a female, or how a man supports another man, or how a woman supports another woman, or how a woman supports a man. I just think it's so worthwhile to consider the nuances of what comes into play. And I think they spoke in brief to what the wounds that get triggered relating to the mother wound or the father wound, and how there might be, I think it was something along the lines of, if a man is primarily seeking women, they're trying to heal something related to the mother wound, right? And in vice versa, if there's I don't know if it's relating to the coaching role, but they're speaking to how if a woman is seeking a male coach, in some cases it could be pertaining to the father wound, and there might be some unintegrated attachment trauma that they're trying to work through that relationship. And I think it's possible that a person could benefit if they're introducing awareness to this for the first time, but I think as that post is making very clear, over the long term, there's possibilities for exploitation, manipulation, unethical practice, especially with some of these coaches that don't understand where those lines exist necessarily. So yeah, just gonna let that one simmer for a minute. I'm curious if you're listening. Yeah, what are your thoughts around that? And also where there exists exceptions. There might exist exceptions. So they were speaking to where the male coach can actually serve a role in helping the woman in this case integrate her experience of doing the deeper work. So there can be a secondary role that a masculine can present that is unique to them, where they can support the female. So I don't think they were trying to speak in terms of absolutes. There were certain topics where there was more absolutes, but I think generally speaking, they were trying to find they were asking the question, what's the more appropriate role for a masculine coach to play when working with the feminine energy? And based on the nature of some trauma and the way people are trying to heal from that, how they might actually be more susceptible. And there's a responsibility for these embodied masculines to show up with integrity. Gosh, I love listening to this water, this rushing water, but I hope it's not too loud. These condenser mics, I hope I'm not too loud either, but who's to say, right? Maybe I'm coming in just the right audio level. Another thing I want to speak to is I'm getting more familiar with working with women professionally, whether, in my counseling practice, I only really worked with a few women when I was training. A lot of women in my cohort, of course, while I was a student counselor, but when I was doing a practicum, I worked with a couple women. And most of my counseling clients, again, I'm still new to counseling, most of them have been men so far, and many of my coaching clients have been men, with the exception of a couple people. And I don't know, I never know why a coaching relationship ends. I don't say prematurely, because, some of these coaching relationships went on for a while, but then they end at a certain point. And I always kind of felt insecure about, am I not capable of supporting women, even just in the basic ways? I'm not referring to some of the deeper work that was being referred to in that post, right? Just trying to not get too upset or feel like I'm losing confidence in myself based on not being able to support women in certain situations, and just accepting that there are certain people that just certainly prefer healing with their own gender, and there are very good reasons for that, and I honestly don't question that in pretty much every case that I've worked with women. But now I'm moving back into, okay, I really want to support women in coaching, and I really want to find a way to do that that feels aligned with my values and is supporting people, not causing harm, and I'm outlining clear boundaries and setting strong agreements, and ultimately also want to work with women in co-facilitating roles and understanding how to create those agreements, and feel like as a masculine I can support a woman in that, and not feel like I'm projecting some kind of unhealed trauma onto them, which, by the way, when you're co-facilitating, triggers happen for sure. Things come up for us and emotions happen, and I think it's pretty normal. And guess I'm just trying to find a way to lead from the place of a masculine that I would say embodies integrity and supports females regardless of what role. So whether it's from co-facilitation, or whether it's from me facilitating group spaces, or, working with a female coaching client or working with a female counseling client, I really am trying my best to learn. And of course, some of that will come from experience. And I believe some of that will also be directly connected to the female relationships I have, the friendships I have in my life, and probably the intimate relationships I've had in the past in some degree, some less direct degree. right? My relationships to the women in my family, my mother especially, right? So it's like I can see there being connections there. I can see there being value to understanding that as a man, working with a woman will certainly feel different with a woman, with a woman, right? With women in general, it will feel different. It'll bring up different things. It will be on some level more difficult or less intuitive, based on the fact that I don't have the perspective. And I think that's what they were saying so much in that post, which I really agree with, is like, if you're lacking perspective overall, do you have the openness to learn from that person? And is this a situation where it's ethical for you to use this as a learning opportunity? I think that's an extension of all mental health practices. You have to really discern, all right, is this a situation where it's ethical for me to be in the position of learning something? And I think we're always learning too, right? We're always learning from our clients or our friends or our teachers or supervisors, or whatever. But it's like, there's a difference between maybe a low stakes conflict and leaning into having a capacity to repair and create further trust with a client, versus maybe it's a very, very vulnerable topic, right? It's a very, very triggering topic for that person, and they're actively processing that trauma, and you leaning into it and coming from a place of maybe dysregulation, or there's just a lack of perspective, so you're not able to witness them in a way, and you're just trying to kind of like use that as a teaching opportunity. That feels like that's not necessarily respecting that person and their right to safety, right? The trust they've put in you as a coach or counselor, facilitator, right? I don't think it's fair that we go around toting that we have certain skill sets, and then when we're required to show up in a certain way in those containers, then we're not able to show up in that way, and we're using it as an opportunity just to simply learn how to do the thing that we claim to do. So, feels like this is an extension of that last topic, but it also feels like this is a new topic in itself, right? It's kind of like knowing when and where is the appropriate place to learn about something for maybe the first time, or from kind of like an amateur perspective, or where we ought to be more trained and more skilled, and ought to have that level of expertise and can create that safety internally to show up for another person, and we're not just getting stuck in our own experience. I'd like to think that's what we're paying for when we're going to trained experts, right? It's the competency, not expecting them to be perfect necessarily, but just to be a basic level of competent, so that they can trust in us and they can feel safe in their body, and I would say deeper healing can occur. So I'm starting to notice I'm getting kind of cold here. You can probably hear it in my voice. I think the air out here is a lot chillier than I'd originally planned for, and I don't think I can continue podcasting while I'm freezing my butt off, but I'm hoping this records, and if it does, thank you for tuning into my podcast today out in the forest. Hopefully you enjoyed the nature sounds, and I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon. Take care, and see ya.
I need more guests. So if you feel like you'd be a good guest, reach out. And if you're interested in working with me one-on-one, please reach out over Instagram, Facebook, or through my email, featheroflightcounseling@outlook.com. I have available slots for counseling. Additionally, I have parts workshops that I'm running each week. So Saturdays at 10 a.m. we'll be meeting this week, and each week following, where we can bring in discussions around parts. You can share about things that you're noticing about your parts, and I will offer some education around working with your parts. So thank you so much. Have a great rest of your afternoon. Take care. Bye.